Back to the sharpening station now. Let's hone our second blade, which is a blade out of number 7 Veritas plane. It is PM-V11 steel blade, and to sharpen this particular blade I'll be using a sophisticated, more advanced version of the honing guide, also made by Veritas. So let's go quickly through this process. The process itself will repeat what we have already done with the A2 blade just before. However, a couple of interesting points may come out from using this particular jig. And the blade is wider and it's a different type of steel, so let's see how we go. First, just checking the dimension of the blade. It's basically 60 millimeters, and this particular jig is marked on the side here for different width of the blade. It is marked in inches, so I'll probably just need to get another ruler here and measure that in inches, and we'll find the blade is spot on 2 inches, which means that for the setup of our jig, I'll be putting the blade with an edge of the blade around this mark, which says 2 inches here. The jig consists of 2 parts. One is the angle controlling bit part, which will hold our blade and will help us to maintain the consistent angle. Then the second part is only required in the beginning of the process, just to set up the correct angle. Effectively, it allows you to set up any angle that you like on the scale. There are 3 different settings and they are color coded depending on what angle you're choosing. So we, as I mentioned before, generally trying to aim for 25 degrees primary bevel and 30 degrees secondary bevel. I've chosen this value here for this particular blade between 25 and 30, around about 27 degrees primary bevel. And then I will be using the feature of this jig, which is a quick adjuster to create a primary bevel. By rotating this knob, you can elevate this part of the roller is eccentric. So basically, when you rotate this knob, the roller will go slightly up or down, and it will change the angle by around about 2 degrees. So if we are starting with 27 plus 2, the secondary bevel will be around 29 degrees, which is good enough for me, especially given I'll be using the high pitch frog in the plane. Mostly, as I mentioned before, I work with Australian timbers, which are difficult grain timbers. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start setting this up. So we first of all putting this part of the jig on like this to align the mark with the 2 inches, which is the width of our blade. And then we inserting the blade here with bevel up, and when the jig is held upside down, and we just push it in until we reach this stop here, which means the protrusion of the blade from the jig is precisely what we need to achieve the angle shown on this scale here. So now we fix the blade in the jig, make sure it's basically held up on both sides equally, and then we now remove this part of the jig, which is no longer needed since our blade is set up at the required setting. The process, as I mentioned, will be the same as before. We're going to be using 600 reed stone to begin with, and then we move on to 1200, and then we finish off with 4000. Let's spray the stone with a bit of water and a little bit of soap, and start honing. The Veritas jig that I'm using now is much more stable, so the roller is very wide as opposed to the one that we used before. The roller was in the middle and was kind of narrow, which was making the jig prone to rocking from side to side. This one is very stable, and especially for a wide blade like this, is a good match perhaps, and basically allows us to maintain this angle and maintain the stability of the blade. As I mentioned before, the fact that we now sharpen the bevel down, the blade from the bevel down plane, means that we don't have to be that precise with the angle, because the actual attack angle or the presentation angle of the blade is not going to change. That angle is maintained by the angle of the frog in the plane. So let's check what is happening there. PM-V11 steel is also quite hard, but as we can see, we start getting lines, the sign of sharpening pretty much all the way across, with a little bit still missing on this side. So I'll do a little more on the 600 until we get a line all the way across the width of the blade. So hopefully this should do it. Yep, now I'm getting the sign of sharpening all the way across. And let's rotate the stone to a higher 1200 grit and spray the surface a little bit as well. And continue our sharpening on the 1200 grit now. So we are moving quite quickly now, since the blade was in good condition, was not chipped. Again, didn't require for the edge to be restored. Effectively, we're just honing the blade to restore the razor sharp edge. We can observe the slur developing, which is a good sign. We also need to check for the burr on the edge of the blade. Let's do that now. So in the case of A2 blade, we've seen a distinct wire coming off. In this case, there's not a lot coming off. I don't actually feel the hook on the other side either. So as I mentioned before, the burr sometimes forms quite distinctly depending on the type of the steel and depending on what you're doing with it. But I can see the sharpening has gone all the way across the edge there. It's not missing any spots, so that's really good. I think this is pretty much it. We don't need to do any more. So now the key difference also between the bevel down and bevel up planes here. When we plane the wood, we don't want to leave marks, what they call tracks, from the blade of the plane. What happens when you use the plane, this sharp corner has a tendency to dig into the wood, and obviously because there is no material removal next to it, you will potentially see a track occurring on the surface of the timber. So to avoid that, or to minimize that effect, which we don't want to have, is that a little trick you can do. You can put a little chamfer on each side, on each corner of the blade, so to round off these corners effectively and lift them up a little bit of the timber. So when the blade takes the shaving, the edges of the blade will not dig into, they will not create this sharp border between the area where the plane took off the timber and where it didn't. So to do that, basically just put the blade back on the stone, and what we're gonna do, we're just gonna tilt it slightly like so, and then do a couple of passes on the stone each side of the blade, here and here. So let me demonstrate. Now I'm lifting the right hand side up and I'm rounding off the left corner, and then I'm doing the same on the right corner. And that's pretty much it. I have only done it on 1200 grit because I don't want that to be, you know, too pronounced. Gentle curve is enough. So that's all it takes basically there. And then we can move on to the 3000. As I said, I don't feel the burr, so there's no need to take off the burr at the moment or do anything there. I just want to clean the blade from the remains of the higher grit stone. Let's finish this off. So just give about 30 seconds probably on this stone for the primary bevel, and then let's create the secondary bevel. As I said, this particular jig has got a feature which allows us to elevate the blade, so we can dial the knob to 6 o'clock position, which lifts up the blade a little bit by 1 or 2 degrees. And we can now progress to the let's check what is happening there, whether we can see the secondary bevel. It has just started to appear. It's sort of like a half of millimeter wide, which is not too far away from what we need it to be. Let's do a little more. And I would also like to give the final polish, if you like, to the corners. Remember, we've rocked the jig and we rounded them off a little bit. We put this little chamfer on them. Let's do the same on the 4000 grit stone. So that's pretty much it. I'll do the opposite side as well, as we've done before, so you can do it without even removing the blade from the jig. So I'll just do a few passes here just to make sure the opposite side is completely flat and also polished to the same level. And then we'll just do a final couple of passes only in the direction away from the blade to finish it off. So that's pretty much it. After this, we repeat the buffing process on the leather strobe to create a razor sharp edge on this blade.